So now we're going to look at a comparison of the forward rate to the spot rate. So if the forward rate is greater than the spot rate, we say that the foreign currency is selling at a premium. So in this example, the spot rate is 0.7 and the forward rate is 0.6. So the pound is expected to appreciate. The pound will buy more dollars in the future. So the forward rate for the pound is at a premium. So we expect the opposite to be true. If the forward rate is less than today's spot rate, the foreign currency is selling at a discount. So we see here that the pound is expected to depreciate to the dollar, and in the future, the pound will buy fewer dollars. So the forward rate for the pound is at a discount. What determines the relationship between the spot and forward rate is the relationship between domestic and foreign interest rates. So it's a combination of interest rates and inflation, what is happening in that country and then between the two countries. So we talk about a couple of different theories for foreign exchange trading. This first one is called absolute purchasing power parity, where the price of an item is the same regardless of the currency used to purchase it or where it is selling. So the requirement for absolute purchase parity to hold, for this theory to hold, is that there are no transaction costs, there are no barriers to trade, no taxes, tariffs, etc., and that there's no difference in the commodity between locations. This absolute purchase power parity rarely holds in practice. It's usually only for very, very uniform traded goods. So it's very rare that we don't have transaction costs or taxes or tariffs or anything on the trade, or that two products would be completely identical in each location. Then we get to the relative purchasing power parity. So this shows an inflation exchange rate relationship. So it talks about what causes changes in exchange rates, because the exchange rates depend on both the interest rates and the relative inflation between countries. So we have that the expected exchange rate at any given time is the current spot exchange rate times 1 plus the inflation rate in a foreign country minus the inflation rate in the US to the power of time. So we'll look at this example. We have the current Canadian spot rate is 1.1417. The expected US inflation is 3% per year, and expected Canadian inflation is 2%. So will the US dollar appreciate or depreciate relative to the Canadian dollar? And what is the expected exchange rate 1 year later? So we put these numbers into our equation. So the spot rate right now is 1.1417, and then given the current inflation amount, we expect in 1 year that the spot rate will be 1.1303. So the US dollar is going to depreciate relative to the Canadian dollar. So capitalizing on the interest rate differential between two countries while covering exchange rate risk with a forward contract is called covered interest arbitrage. So we saw an example of triangle arbitrage where we just took advantage of the current spot rate between two countries. What we're looking at now is using a forward contract to do that arbitrage. So covered interest arbitrage. So we're going to look at this example. We have Swiss francs versus the US dollar. We have 10% interest in the US and 5% interest in Switzerland on risk free. So, what is the arbitrage opportunity? We borrow $100 at 10% interest. We convert that into 200 Swiss francs and invest the 200 Swiss francs at 5% for 1 year. We do a forward contract to exchange Swiss francs in 1 year at 1.9. We then receive 200 in 1 year times 1.05, that's our 5% interest. So we receive 210 Swiss francs. We convert that back to dollars, and that translates into $110.53. We then repay our loan that we took out for 1 year at the US interest, and we were able to earn 53 cents by taking advantage of a forward contract and risk-free interest rates. So you can see that example here where we've converted, we've got the spot rate is 2, the forward rate is 1.9. How we've used the forward rate to lock into a contract to generate income. Of course, if we had done $5 million instead of $100, there would be a much larger profit from taking advantage of that. This is the interest rate parity. So interest rate parity, investors should expect to earn the same return on similar risk securities in all countries. So our forward and spot rates are direct quotations. The RUS is periodic interest rate in the home country or US, and RFC is periodic interest rate in the foreign country. So we are looking at the difference between the forward and spot rate as related to the relationship between the interest rates of the two countries. Exchange rate risk is just the risk that the value of cash flow in one currency translated from another currency will decline due to a change in exchange rate. So it's just a natural consequence of international operations in a world where relative currency values move up and down. So you never know what the exchange rate is going to be in the future when you are exchanging things. So if you go and you exchange US dollars to a foreign currency and then translate them back at a different date, there can be a loss. So how long you hold those depends on what the different fluctuations are. You can also have a gain dependent on how the exchange rates. You can have short run exposure. So that's the risk from the day-to-day fluctuations in exchange rates. So you could go today and exchange money, and then tomorrow the exchange rate will have shifted in such a way that you could have, if you had waited a day, you would have had a better exchange. That is a risk that you took. In order to manage that risk, you can use a forward agreement or a forward contract to guarantee an exchange rate, or you can use foreign currency options to lock in exchange rates. In long run exposure, these are long run fluctuations from anticipated changes in relative economic conditions. So it's more difficult to hedge against long run exposure than it is against short run, because for short run exposure, you can use a forward contract to hedge against that. But you try to match the long run inflows and outflows in the currency. If you borrow in the foreign country, that may help you mitigate some of the issues with exposure from exchange rate risk. There's also translation exposure. So income from foreign operations translated back to US dollars for accounting purposes. So for our financial record purposes, even if we're not physically converting the money from one currencies to the other, the corporations with international operations do have to translate those operations back to US dollars for accounting purposes under US GAAP. So there can be gains and losses. If they flow through the income statement, then we would have a huge earnings per share volatility. So we know that investors don't like to see their earnings per share change like that. So accounting regulations, FASB passed a law in 1985 that allows for cash flows to be converted at the prevailing exchange rates and those currency gains and losses to be accumulated in a special account within shareholders' equity so that it doesn't show up on the income statement and affect the net income that is used for earnings per share calculations. Large multinational firms may need to manage exchange rate risk associated with several different currencies. So if the firm might need to consider its net exposure to currency risk instead of just looking at each currency separately. So if an international multinational firm has operations in many currencies, then every single currency exposes a risk to translation. We can trying to hedge against individual currencies can be expensive and may actually make our exposure worse. So it's better to try to hedge against those as a net exposure or looking at them all together. Other kinds of risk that we can get into with currency exchanges are political risk. So changes in value due to political actions in the foreign country. So one of the examples the textbook talks about, and maybe one of the most popular examples or most current news event situations would be Brexit. So in 2006, when the United Kingdom voted to remove themselves from the European Union, at that time the vote came through, then the value of a pound versus US dollar plummeted. So that's an example of a political action that greatly affected the exchange rates between those two currencies. If you invest in countries that have unstable governments, you should require higher returns. So some countries have very, very high rates of inflation. There's a higher political risk in other countries. So really looking at what business that you're looking for and what you're looking at. Cryptocurrency has become popular as ways to help mitigate both exchange rate risk and political risk and inflation risk with some foreign countries. I know in Venezuela, with their really, really high rates of inflation, that cryptocurrency has become extremely popular there. And the extent of the political risk really depends on the nature of the business that is doing business within that operation. So the more dependent a business is on other operations within the firm, the less valuable it is to others. And natural resource development is very valuable to others. So there's less risk in operations that are dependent on another. So if we're just manufacturing parts that are going to be transferred somewhere else, that's a dependent on some other thing within the firm. Where if we're there and we're developing real estate or looking at the resources of that country, et cetera, then that exposes us to more exchange rate risk within that country. And that is the end of chapter 18.